Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Day Zero podcast. This is episode 14. I'm Spectre. With me is Z and Auntie. We were a little bit late starting today. We had a few technical issues, mostly on my end. You may notice there's a little bit of background noise and stuff like that with my mic. So I apologize for that in advance. We'll try to fix that for future episodes.
Yeah, it seems to be all right for now, but just as kind of a warning there, we have been having some audio issues, so you seem all right now. So as you're saying that, it just doesn't quite make sense, but you'll possibly hear exactly what we mean in a few minutes.
Yeah. So before we jump into topics, I am going to be continuing the Android Binder UAF live stream on Wednesday. So I did kind of like a part one. I did a stream on Wednesday, like the past Wednesday. But we ran into some issues when it came to like testing and getting to the exploit writing part. So I'm gonna be continuing that on Wednesday at the same time at 8 p.m. Eastern. So so you can tune into that if you're around. And so I guess we can jump into topics. So we'll talk about Sudo CVE 2019 14287. Look at that, even flows right. So you probably heard about this if you follow any InfoSec stuff on Twitter or anything like that. So a brief summary of it is basically if sudo is configured a certain way to allow a user to run commands as any user with the all keyword, you can specify the user ID -1 to run commands as root. Yeah, I'm guessing you heard about this, C. So what were your thoughts on how this story was publicized? Because I have a few thoughts on it, but I wanted to get yours first.
Well, I don't have any thoughts necessarily on how it was publicized. I mean, obviously people see an issue in Sudo and there's going to, be that jump to, oh my God, what's, the world's ending. I thought it was an interesting little exploit though. I mean, kind of in the details there, you can specify either like the user, like -u in your user, or the user ID. And what ends up happening is just the
Okay.
set real
Yeah,
effective.
I was just gonna say with the way it was publicized that it was very sensationalized. It was one of the more sensationalized things I've seen in a while. A lot of people skipped that caveat that it needs to be set up in a way that allows people to run. Like the conditions that needed to be met for this bug to be exploited weren't really mentioned very prominently on a lot of sources that covered it.
Yeah, I mean, because, I mean, obviously you're going to get more clicks saying, you can bypass restrictions on sudo. But yeah, I mean, so to be clear for everybody listening, the restrictions here are you basically need a setup where a user is allowed, in kind of on the etc sudoers file, you either need you need some that allows them to run commands with an arbitrary user ID. That's kind of essential to this arbitrary user ID, and they can't be allowed to use root.
So oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's kind of like the big bypass here. Is it ends up letting you use root, and that ends up happening because of the set real effect of user ID syscall. On that syscall, it has kind of a special case if you send it either the user ID -1 or the unsigned equivalent of -1. In that special case, it just won't change what your user ID was when it calls that. So sudo going to be run as root. It just won't drop the privileges. So it's kind of an exception, that one case where you can provide that that user ID and you're being denied root, which in my experience is a fairly rare situation to run into, where you have the allowment for arbitrary user IDs, but not root. I'm sure someone out there has done that. I haven't actually seen that though.
Wow, you went deep on the technical details of that. I'll be honest, like that's some cool information. I didn't.
It's a cool little exploit actually. Like, I mean, my thoughts were, realistically, you're probably not running into this too often, but this might be useful elsewhere. I'm thinking maybe you're able to control some config file that knowing about how set real effect of UID works. like that information I think is kind of useful. I wasn't aware of -1 kind of being the special case. Generally you're using that to change the running user ID. So I'm in this case, like that's interesting information. The fact that it's with sudo is, yeah, okay, that's cool. In terms of practical cases, like, yeah, definitely sensationalized, like you mentioned.
Sorry, can you repeat that last bit? You just cut out for me for a little bit there. I just wanted to.
Yeah, I just said it was sensationalized, like you mentioned. Don't worry about. As we mentioned, we are having some audio issues here. Spectre is unable to hear both myself and Auntie. Well, Auntie hasn't spoken yet, but as I mentioned, we are having some issues. So,
Yeah,
I don't know if
I
you.
did actually want to ask Auntie about something though. Auntie, I don't know if you heard anything about this on the like the threat world or anything like that. But how likely do you think this is? Like, how much impact do you think it's going to have in the wild?
I mean, it's been patched already, right?
Yeah, yeah. It was patched recently, so.
I mean, my take is always simply that, depending first off how fast they fix the issue, right? So if it remains an issue that's been present for a long time, then you tend to have problems. But I haven't seen. I mean, I thought this was interesting because I haven't seen anyone, like running these commands. Because normally, if someone's going out and running a campaign, leveraging something like this, it seems pretty straightforward, right? It's not some complex bypass from what I can tell. So I would assume it'd be picked up pretty easily by some IDS and IPS. I mean, we probably won't see much. If it does happen, it'll be obviously on the old servers that for some reason aren't updating sudo and stuff like that. But I just don't see it being a real prevalent thing. If it had gone unfixed, there's always a good chance it would obviously wreak havoc, and maybe was prior to this. But I would be more or less convinced that if this was out there in the wild, someone would have caught on very quickly.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I mean, it's used for privilege escalation, so it's already, it's not like going to be mass spam by anybody, and it is a really specific use case of you're being denied root, but you're being allowed all user IDs or arbitrary user IDs.
Yes.
That's a very weird situation in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay. This is another bug I can see being prominent in a CTF or something like that.
Yeah, so. I could totally see like a hack the box challenge coming out, in a couple weeks with this exploit there. I did notice there's a couple tool changes that had updated to included and stuff, but I'm not, like, I wouldn't be too worried about this unless you hit that fairly obscure use case. It's just a non-issue for you. Because this would only work for root. Like, there aren't other accounts that you could do this for. And if there were, like, you're generally, again, not giving arbitrary user access and restrictions.
Yeah. So there is another topic, though, that we have that doesn't have such a obscure use case. So there was an unpatched Linux bug that may open devices to serious attacks over Wi-Fi. Couldn't talk there for a minute. So it was a buffer overflow. So I looked a little bit into this. It was pretty interesting. So it was in the Realtek Wi-Fi driver for Linux. The most prominent part of the report is that it's a zero click. It doesn't require any interaction on the target's part. It's entirely, no interaction required. So, that's a bit scary just in the fact of how it can be abused. The thing is, though, like, you do have to be within a radio range of a malicious device. It's not like something you can get hit with, from another country or something like that. It's a more localized attack.
But you don't even need to be on the same network. It uses the Wi-Fi Direct, or it's in the Wi-Fi Direct stuff. Specifically, it's a lack of a upper bound check when doing a notice of absence messages, which basically because Wi-Fi Direct is kind of like, it's a bit of a weird thing. Like, I've never actually used it, but it's used for like peer-to-peer communication. So like, one device will network with another device directly without needing an access point between them. So that means like you don't need to be on a Wi-Fi, you don't need to be, anything. You just need to be within kind of Wi-Fi range of the malicious device. So the notice of absence thing is basically just the peer-to-peer group owner announces periods during which essentially they're going offline or they're going absent. That way devices can power down or save energy and know they're not going to receive any messages during that period. So like it's a feature that's just kind of always there, always on.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
As you kind of mentioned there, the flaw does date back to.
Did you want to add anything on there? Sorry, you cut it for me again, so I just want to make sure.
Yeah, well, I was already saying it. The flaw does date back to 2013.
Okay.
As you kind of already mentioned, but one thing that was interesting is no proof of concept was developed for this exploit. Like they found the issue, they reported it, but at no point did they develop the proof of concept for it. Well, it sounds like they're still working on it.
Yeah, so I do have a few things I can say on that. I looked a little bit more into this bug, into the technical side of it, and it seems that they're not entirely sure how exploitable it is. Like they say in a quote here, this on paper, this overflow should be exploitable, but they don't know for sure. So I looked more into the technical details. So honestly, I looked at the code for this driver, and the code is pretty terrible, which isn't too surprising. It's a Wi-Fi driver. Typically networking stacks are the weaker points in the defense of kernels and stuff like that. So the overflow happens in a for loop. Like they iterate through this array, and I think the index that can be corrupted is 16 bits. So you're a bit limited on how far out of bounds of the array you can get. And there's a lot of layers of abstraction. It's all in the PCI API, so there's like a whole bunch of stuff compounded on top of it. But at the very base, it is allocated in like the normal heap. It's KZ-alloced. So I can definitely see it being exploitable if you can do some heap grooming. It's a pretty large object as well, so it's in a cache where it'd probably be a fairly stable exploit if you got it to work. It's just that like getting to that stage, like getting the heap grooming would probably be the hardest part.
Yeah, I mean there's obviously the technical aspect as you're going into. I do wonder about how far into the Wi-Fi Direct process you need to get before it will start accepting like those NOAA frames.
Yeah, I'm not sure on that.
Because that could be another area that kind of limits it. They seem to be announcing it as though it's basically exploitable. Like treating it as a very serious attack, so I assume that's pretty reasonable to access, but I don't actually know that for sure.
Yeah. That being said, so yeah, I guess I was gonna ask if there's been any reports of this potential, like, suspected cases of it being used in the wild, but since they're not entirely sure if it's exploitable at all, I guess not.
I mean, if they had seen it in the wild, they would have kind of mentioned something about that, so I'm going to go and say no, that this is just a new finding.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think this is an area to keep an eye on, because I'm pretty sure there's been other vulnerabilities found in Realtek before.
Sure. I mean, they're just very popular. I mean, so they're a juicy target. Obviously, any kernel exploits are nice targets in general, especially some that can be accessed remotely. I mean, maybe not over the internet, but I'd still count this as like a remote exploit because you're not a user on the system. It's a good exploit. If it works, it's pretty solid.
Yeah.
I just had a small question. I mean, for research like this, right, where there's no proof of concept, and the vulnerabilities out there, I mean, does it really help people most times? I mean, just to know the availability of it, but not knowing really more details.
Oh, do you mean like threat actors? Like,
yeah, not even just threat actors. Like, again, I have my Linux machine set up, right? But if it's like going, like, it's a big problem in a lot of like threat circles, right? Where it's like, hey, there's this problem that exists, but we don't know how to fix it. It's probably out there. It tends to be like a scare tactic a lot of times. I was just curious if that's something here, or that it's more of like a, hey, we did find this thing that we know that it exists and we're working on fixing it? Like, is it to calm people down? That was my only curiosity, is that not having a POC and
I
not
mean,
even sure if it really
it's
works.
reasonably
Someone
common.
could, essentially be like, well, maybe it could do this, but maybe it doesn't do any of that, if that makes sense.
It's reasonably common. Just in the sense of having a CV without an exploit, that happens all the time. Somebody reports it. I mean, most CVs don't really have exploits, but somebody else just goes around and actually builds the exploit and releases it.
Okay.
That's pretty common. I mean, yeah, it wouldn't be unheard of for somebody to also release the exploit with them. Like do the CV and an exploit at the same time. Like, it happens, or at least the exploit at the time of publication, assuming there's a hold period on the actual CV reporting. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely pretty common to not have an exploit there. Okay, no, that makes sense. I'll have to look more into the Twitter thread and stuff where this released, because I was just curious more about the process now, that if they know it exists and how they validated it for the most part, besides obviously. Yeah, well, I mean, in this case, it looks like they would have just validated it by looking at the code, seeing the issue there, accepting it as an actual bug, regardless of the exploitability of it. Okay. As we were just talking about, no proof of concept there. It does raise some questions, but I think the validation of it just came down to, like, yeah, the code's an issue. Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Interesting nonetheless.
Yeah.
So just before we move on to the next topic.
Another huge story this week was the U.S. law enforcement tracing Bitcoin transfers to nab the largest child porn site on the dark web. So obviously it's a pretty heavy topic, so we'll stay mostly more to the technical side, right? Don't want to go too deep into the politics of it, if you will.
Maybe not the politics. I do want to say that the owner of this was younger than I was expecting.
23, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is pretty young. But I think this story is a really good example of that mantra that just because you're using Tor doesn't mean or Tor and Bitcoin and stuff like that doesn't mean you're safe from being found. So,
well, I mean, Tor alone has never really been a secure option. I mean, that's been, well known. But yeah, so Bitcoin, at least for the last while, has kind of been, at least the scare tactics have been saying, where, the world's going to end because criminals can make all of these untraceable transactions. And the key thing with this is, law enforcement traced Bitcoin transfers to kind of detect this. I did find it interesting. The site would create Bitcoin wallets for everybody, for all the users that they were to use for the site. I did kind of find that interesting, that kind of gave a starting point for the law enforcement also. Or I think they mentioned they're up to like 1 million wallets were open for the site. Not all in use, but having the capacity for 1 million users.
Yeah, it's pretty common with a lot of dark web markets, though. Is that they create one for you when you join, so that basically you send money to that. They have a script or whatever that pulls that in from, that goes, okay, we've got money in your account now. And
that makes sense.
So it's pretty common. What's interesting, it does allow, from a legal perspective, I wouldn't say a legal perspective, a sloppy admin, if they're not doing much, they're just sending it to a main wallet. It typically makes it very easy to track all that, right? So if they're cutting a little bit off the top each transaction or whatever and just sending it to one wallet, I know that's been an issue for a lot of guys where they're too lazy to try and add a little complexity to it. So it's just like, well, gee, it's this, wallet with 15 million transactions and over, or not 15 million transactions, but $15 million and thousands of transactions. Well, it's got to be obviously the main way. This is really crazy. Sorry, Spectre. Out a bit. Did you have something to say?
Oh yeah, no, that's all good. I just wanted to ask, like, have you guys heard of this chain analysis software before? Because, like, I feel like with how powerful it seems to be, that we should have heard about it before, but I haven't. So I'm just wondering if
I've seen it brought up before, but Andy, I think you might have some actual experience with it.
Yeah, I mean, I used it. I think it was probably at least over 6 months ago. And it's something that I've actually had the pleasure of like sitting in front of the people on behalf of with my team and having them tell us what their kind of future plans are and how these things work. And going too crazy. I mean, the fascinating part of the platform is even with like a lot of times Bitcoin mixers, occasionally they were able to, if it was very weakly mixed, even see the output and still trace back to the possible original connections. And essentially what they're doing is they're tracking like BTCE, and you see all these like different exchanges, right? Coins and all this. I can't remember exactly the details they went into, but it's impressive that they basically go and say, okay, let's find all the major wallets for major exchanges, and they go and monitor transactions going out. And I think a lot of these exchanges, in fairness, also publish as part of the Alliance their transactions and stuff, so that companies like this can go and help track for law enforcement. So the hard part is it's basically a GUI. It's exactly what you see in the article here. It's just a bunch of little circles, and for each transaction, it pops up another one. So it's only for Bitcoin though. I think what I thought was interesting in that chain analysis, I don't know if they've addressed it yet, is no one's talked about like Monero or any of the privacy-centric coins being tracked at all. So I'm curious as to why, I wonder when it comes down to these things if it's always just people are too lazy. Because I thought the craziest part was they said around 90 people were arrested. Is that right? I think.
Yeah, that sounds like the right number. I think the number in my head is 97, but I might not be.
It's 92. There we go.
92. Okay.
92 individuals is a lot of people to track back. So that's, I don't know. I feel like I'd love to read more about it because that's a lot of people. Typically, like when you see like arrests on dark web stuff, they do often happen in one big swoop because like a marketplace gets compromised or something. But a lot of times it's just like trickles, right? You get one here and one there. But that's a lot of people. So I thought that was just impressive overall. That means they tracked down at least, 92 people. So I'd be more interested. I obviously don't care to go to the website, but I would be interested in seeing if they even pushed for any type of OPSEC or any type of, security concerns that they would say don't directly cash out to your exchange or so on and so forth. Because people can also track now, all the exchanges basically require ID, and I think there's probably a certain amount they will tip off to federal authority to see moving out to an exchange, right? So
yeah, well, again, I mean, the whole Bitcoin Alliance, they're definitely going to be reporting stuff. So, but anyway, that's going to be most of your users probably going with that, or even just anybody that's kind of looking up.
I did want to say that many of the article stated that a lot of the arrests were directly from the Know Your Customer program, so providing the investigators with the identification. They did say they didn't get all of them through that, though. They said the ones, like some of them that they didn't get through Know Your Customer, they used open source intelligence on. So, you were talking about, OPSEC-wise and stuff like that. It seems like a few people got nailed because of bad OPSEC on that.
Yeah, no, and that's usually the big case is people.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, people are it's going to be bad OPSEC every time. If you had good OPSEC, you're not getting caught.
But my small thought is for people that are kind of like, I assume in this world of whatever, this particular website, I assume are, a lot more greedy and lustful about things. So they tend to push aside like OPSEC concerns, right? Because they're determined to get kind of what they're hoping for, right? And that happens a lot with like people who buy drugs. Is sometimes, they're like, well, is it worth the risk of going to jail? And sometimes just getting whatever it is I'm trying to acquire from the dark web much easier, right? Because it's a long process for operational security to be 100%.
I did want to jump back a little bit though, because you were talking about you were cutting out a little bit for me, so I just wanted to like double check. Were you talking about potentially using like, you're not sure why people aren't using alternate currencies instead of Bitcoin? Is that what you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, not to tell people and have criminals use more, privacy centric ones. But yes, I am surprised since there is an abundance of them. There's multiple that are tested. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think part of the reason for that is altcoins. It's very easy to influence them, because The problem with cryptocurrency is the more of it you have, the more influence you have over the market.
Mhm.
So with altcoins, where they're a lot cheaper and stuff like that, it's a lot easier to influence than Bitcoin is. So that's probably part of it. Is like people don't want to use altcoins that can potentially be not as stable, I guess, than Bitcoin. That would be my primary guess at that.
Oh yeah, no, it's hard because those are, that's been a thing for a long time. I mean, but there's coins like Monero are really established, so that
Okay, fair point.
in theory, it's not supposed to be that easy, right? Obviously, in practice, it varies with people who are called whales, right?
Yeah. Okay.
But
I just wanted to double check on that.
I always find it fascinating. There have been Monero only websites, but they don't last very long because I think it's very difficult to obtain those privacy coins. Like Shapeshift, I believe, stopped allowing people to easily transfer Bitcoin to Monero, right? So the more people kind of crack down on it and they go, well,
Okay.
nothing good comes from it, I assume is why we're seeing people just stick with Bitcoin, at least easier, right? I can pretty easily go get Bitcoin. It's a whole hassle and process to go and buy Bitcoin and change it to Monero, change it to this, and go and send it to this person, and so on and so forth. And then even finding a site that probably this site, if the admin didn't know how to implement the Monero stuff, like there's just, I thought it was just interesting that all these people use Bitcoin and don't know how to at least try and anonymize themselves, but stupid is this, it does, man.
So, Andy, I did have one question about the chain analysis stuff. How well does it work with like tumblers? I mean, you kind of mentioned at the outset that sometimes it was able to detect like the entry or exit from the tumbler, but is that something that can be counted upon, or are tumblers still kind of like a safe consideration, or even just dropping into like a hot wall like a casino or something?
Yeah, so I think honestly, what I will say is, first and foremost, I'm sure I have to be careful to some degree, so I can talk to them directly. But in my experience, my actual experience with it just depended on the mixing risk. I know that they were able to, with some confidence, I don't want to say de-anonymize, but reduce a lot of the transactions to a individual, right? Based on, I think it was timing. So that's why the longer you often go and tumble your coins, the harder it is. That's a lot of attacks against transactions, right? Is transaction timing, right? Some of the old mixers used to be like, here, you just need 30 minutes of mixing around and we'll get it back to you, right? But logically, that's a bad idea. So I assume that, most of it was correct, but they did outline which ones they were more confident in, and they did put notes as to like, we believe it's this, we believe with confidence based on this, like this is how well it's going to work. So it wasn't like just them blindly labeling, transactions. They were putting assessments to it in some regards. So and looking at the technicality of it, I'm not exactly 100% sure how they do it, but I do know they go and investigate the mixing services. Now, the only thing I'll add to that too is there's a new thing. I don't want to call it a new thing. It's probably been implemented for a long time, but something called coin joins, where basically 100 people or so get together and they go and say, I'm going to put $1,000 in, right? There's usually a minimum and there's a fee for doing it. Everybody gets together and they go and trading their coins. They all throw it in a big pile and it mixes it up, right? And then everybody gets their amount out. Typically, obviously, a little varied from the original amount. And so essentially, while it's not perfect, it acts mostly the same of a tumbler, but it's built into things like Wasabi and I think the other one's Samurai. So I think a lot of it, unfortunately for cyber criminals, I guess, or fortunately, is mixing services are going away. And for the longest time, you didn't even know if you could trust it, probably anyways. But now with them being built into certain Bitcoin wallets, I'm guessing that it's going to be a little more difficult because it's, here or there. It's not ran by a centralized service, but it's ran by, people just contributing to their wallet funds directly to these like coin join transactions. So anyone that's curious about it should look it up. It's very fascinating stuff, and it's probably going to replace mixers. But to answer your original question, it worked pretty well sometimes, but they were upfront with what ones they knew were mixers and ones they weren't really sure of but could be.
All right, yeah. I mean, that's a kind of interesting area. I haven't done a ton with the Bitcoin, so it's just kind of interesting to hear a bit about the move from tumblers into the coin join
Mhm.
style thing. Like, it kind of makes sense as a natural move as the technology will be able to do that and to
Mhm.
kind of push to being a bit more. I'm going to use the term personalized. That's maybe not the quite description or quite an accurate description, but the move kind of makes sense while I'm thinking about it here. So before we move on to the next topic, I do want to tackle one question that was brought up by what's that, Pirate 109 PK. It was actually brought up before we started the stream, so I forgot to kind of address it then. But they have two questions. First, what they have to study, say, to be like you, exploiting stuff like PS5 or maybe PS6 in the future. I assume that's directed at Spectre, because I haven't done any.
So I'm guessing, yeah, I guess that's directed at me, I guess. I'll be honest, when I just jumped into PS4 stuff. I wasn't going to university for computer science or anything like that. I'm still not. And I wasn't too well versed in exploit development when I jumped into PS4 stuff. I just kind of dived in and learned as I went. I think you kind of have to do that. I think you learn a lot doing it that way.
Yeah,
Just because,
I mean, I remember when you were first getting started with that. And yeah, it's like from basically out of nowhere
yeah,
from
it's
our little
just
chat.
like you have to struggle through it to really grasp it. Because when I was first getting involved, there were exploits out, and I would read them, but until you actually start trying to write them, you don't really retain that information very well. You know what I mean? So you just have to kind of have to jump into something. Obviously, though, you don't want to jump into something crazy right away. With the PS4, I started out small. I don't know, some people listening may remember my first PS4 projects I released was mostly edits of existing WebKit exploits. And I wrote a tool that leveraged the WebKit exploit to do some interesting stuff. Like I wrote the PS4 playground for 3.55. Like it took a while before I got to the exploit phase. You got to do a lot of like reconnaissance work on whatever you're working with, and then the more you work with something, your experience kind of builds on top of each other. It kind of stacks, and you start to be able to apply that to other things as well, and then you can pick up other projects faster. So it's just one of those things where you just have to jump into it and learn as you go, really.
Yeah, I will kind of cut in here and mention that um, one of the points that you made was just doing something with it. And I think that's kind of an important thing, is actually writing up some of the exploits. Like, even if you take a known exploit and just start writing it up, start working through and understanding what they did, you're going to start learning the concepts that are involved for when you actually start applying it yourself. So starting off with, maybe find an exploit that's been released that um everything's there. It's like a complete exploit, and just rewrite it in your own way. Just rewrite, understand everything that's going on, and then work backwards from there. Maybe don't let
Yeah,
yourself
exactly.
know how they actually went through, like, whatever, how they did the heat function way or something. Like, don't go through that. Just do it yourself and just kind of keep removing elements that you have to kind of figure out on your own. I think that's a really good way to kind of really just for getting up to speed with modern exploitation. So that's the PS4. That's anything. Like, I haven't done much on the console, so I can't really speak to that. But just with modern exploitation, I think just rewriting exploits is a really good technique. If you're asking a bit more generally about kind of what you have to study, it's binary exploitation. That term will pull up a ton of resources. Uh, but on the more specific level, I think that's one of the best things you can do, is just rewrite exploits. But don't try and hold back until, like, oh, I know everything.
One tip I will give when going into exploitation at first is stay away from C++. You probably want to stay away from browsers. Like, I said that jump into something. Browsers is probably not something you want to jump into, just because C++ is far more like there's so many more complexities at the binary level with all the layers of abstraction they're added and stuff like that. So stick with C when you're starting out. I just wanted to add that on there because I've seen some people try to jump into browsers and stuff like that, and it they just get scared off.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I'm not necessarily going to agree. It's not that I disagree, but at the same time, choosing one of those really big, really hard projects is something a ton of people do, and you get stuck and you kind of work at it, for not months, but for years at a time. And you pick up like everything you need during that period. It takes a lot longer. It's harder to stick it out. So, like, if you're going the route of like, what's not going to scare people off? Yes, stay away from C++, stay away from the really complicated beasts. At the same time, though, having that sort of big project long term, something that you really want to do, like if you really want to do it, just take on that hard project, even if people tell you can't do it. You're going to learn as you go. Yeah, it'll be hard, but if you're really motivated on something, I think that's more important than just the difficulty. It's just if you're motivated to get that done, to do what's needed, that's what you need more so than just avoiding the challenge. And to be clear, like, I mean, using C isn't just avoiding the challenge. Like, there's absolutely challenge there too. But I do think there's a benefit in taking on those projects that are a lot harder than what you should do. They'll take a lot of time. It'll be more difficult, but it can be quite valuable to do that also.
Yeah, it's just you want to make sure that you don't take on a project that's so difficult that it just kills your motivation to work on it, right?
And
Which
that's
is where
kind
I'm
of the
a bit worried
thing,
about
yeah.
browsers.
Like motivation's key, though. So it comes down to if you're really motivated, insanely motivated to get something done, I wouldn't shy away just because we're saying, oh, well, you need a lot of motivation to get that done and it's going to be hard. I mean, I'm also not saying like everybody should jump into it or jump to the hardest thing. It's a balancing thing.
I think, honestly, when you kind of hit it on the head, I mean, full clarity, I'm obviously not anywhere near the RE either of you are, but I think it just goes in general with learning certain things that are technical, is most people don't, like, you either have kind of a personality that way to push through difficulty or you won't sometimes, I think that's a big part of RE and just, again, technical aspects is if you can be that type of person that goes, okay, this has been 3 weeks and I still feel like I'm out in the middle of nowhere. If you've at least been trying, I think it's one of those, land amongst the stars type thing where you're still bound to learn a lot of useful things that even if you haven't, again, written a, full exploit for Chrome, Sandbox Escape and so on, right? That's okay, because if you're still learning the things that go to that part and you're learning what isn't working, you kind of find a cadence with it. So I do agree with you in that picking big projects isn't necessarily a bad idea. I think if you're obviously coming at it from like, I have never ran anything on the command line, I've never touched any C code or anything like that, probably to get some small things out of the way to motivate you and go, okay, now I'm excited, because you start grasping those little things and it builds up into okay, now I can do this. And maybe that's too cliche, but that's just my thoughts on it.
That's absolutely a fair point. I mean, that's kind of another perspective on it too, is doing the small things to build up the momentum. I think in the future we do want to have a larger discussion just on getting started and stuff like this. I think we can kind of move on. Into
I think that answers that question pretty well. I mean, it's just you gotta make sure you pick a project that you'll be able to keep going with, and that's
last thing I would say about it before, and we could totally jump. Sorry, this was a tip that I think a lot of people should do, and maybe it's boring, but the fastest way to learn something, I think, is like, they said, write it down. I think writing, I know it sounds terrible, but writing reports, stepping through what you did if you're presenting it to someone, is also a really good way to remember things, because then you have to actually explain, like, okay, first I did this and then I did X step and that's why this became this. So that I've noticed people a lot of times in interviews struggle to, like, they know a concept, right? It's like a no-brainer for them. But when they have to explain it to anyone, struggle very hard because they've never had to explain it. They just kind of understood in their head. So I would recommend for anyone, as you're learning a lot, especially, it doesn't have to be pretty or anything like that, but start writing like little mini reports about how you did that, so that when it does come time to talk to someone about it, especially, again, if you're trying to pursue a career in it, and just, again, general understanding, it helps to kind of break it into a paper, and then you can go and reiterate that at any time once you've kind of written it down. That's my 2 cents. Sorry, we can go on.
Yeah, no problem. So, talking about shitty security, we had so everyone's heard about the Equifax issues that have been happening, just really, really poor security on all sides. So there was a class action lawsuit actually launched because of that. And there was some details that came out from the filings. And there was a quote that was posted here on Twitter. Furthermore, Equifax employed the username admin and the password admin to protect the portal used to manage credit disputes. So, thought we should just praise
what's
Equifax
interesting
real quick.
with this one is this is also a lawsuit that's coming from the shareholders, basically accusing Equifax of not informing them or misrepresenting their risks, and then showing all of these things that they kind of did incorrectly that most people would consider a large security risk that they didn't inform their shareholders about. So yeah, admin on an internet facing portal which contains sensitive information is one of those very clear issues. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to say that admin is good credentials. I will also mention that this lawsuit does go back all the way to January. We're just kind of seeing it now, sort of covering it. It is kind of older news, I guess, but as far as I know, most people didn't read the lawsuit, so you can have some old news here. That's it. Another thing was they also mentioned, they talk about encryption. Equifax failed to encrypt sensitive data in its custody. And I don't know for sure. It seems like one of the things they mention is that it may have been HTTP, not HTTPS. Like, they may not have even been using encryption at that level. Obviously, this particular quote is dealing more with not encrypting the data at storage. And, I mean, that's a risk. At the same time, when you're talking about a server that's always on, having some, like, full disk encryption protects against very few issues. I mean, you're having your data encrypted isn't going to do much unless somebody steals the drive and no longer has the key. So you have to also be storing the key elsewhere. Otherwise, like on a server, it always needs access to the data. So there's, I don't know. I'm not sure I'd care as much about it. It kind of depends on the details of what was going on with this, and we just don't have it. I did look at the actual report. And it's just, there isn't quite enough information for me to really say. But I did want to kind of bring up that question. How useful is encrypting on a server for anything but being concerned about cold storage? So leaking data and stuff, really, it doesn't seem like crypto has much of a role to play there, unless we're talking about per user encryption. So like the user has to enter their password to decrypt it. That obviously can work. And I believe with some healthcare stuff, that's the type of crypto in use, but this isn't that sort of information.
I think you raise I don't want to defend Equifax here, but I will say there is really a large misconception half the time, and it does drive me nuts when people are like, well, why wasn't it full disk encrypted at all this shit? And it has to be decrypted at some point to be usable, right? I don't think people grasp that, if just 100% encrypted, unreadable at 100% of the time, well, then it's unusable. It has to be decrypted at one point. I mean,
there is homomorphic encryption, which we're actually going to be talking about later on, which you don't need to decrypt it for it to be useful. But sorry, go on. I just want to plug that in.
There are, and we can talk about more in the next one. But I was going to say the hard part is a lot of these concepts, like secure states, are apparently very hard for an organization that realistically it doesn't sound like they had a huge, security team, and obviously didn't have a lot of audits. I mean, it's even simple things like, again, the mobile apps were passing data in plain text, right? To which you could argue, well, what's really the severity, this and that. But I think that there were just a lot of small things that piled up that, it just became something that someone somewhere had to have been auditing something, right? So I think that's really the hard part here. Is not that they made mistakes, because they obviously made a bunch of them, that, it's just insane at the amount of kind of almost, I don't know if I call it negligence or what we can call it at this point.
It's the amount of like really basic or fundamental issues. The type of thing that, maybe only takes 5 or, being really generous here, 30 minutes to an hour to fix and deploy.
Exactly.
Like getting your, I found the entry here that mentions data being transmitted over the internet, not unencrypted. So, like, just setting up TLS appropriately, that shouldn't take a sysadmin all that long. Give them a day or something even, which is a lot longer than it should take. granted, it does depend on their infrastructure and how comfy. If they have to go and, remote into 100 servers, maybe it will take a little bit longer, but then that comes down to just another one of their issues and another one of these things that are just increasing the risk, which is what these shareholders are kind of attacking, is Equifax misrepresenting the risks.
Now, the question I would have is, really, is the individuals employed by Equifax, right? Equifax, whatever, are they at risk of legal trouble? If someone's suing Equifax and they go and say, well, our sysadmins, our, red teamers, whatever, they all said it was secure, they gave us reports. Who does the blame fall on at one point? Is it, I want to say, honestly, unfortunately, I think it comes down to the people who are rolling out these, programs to go and secure internally, do threat hunting, do basic stuff like set up and traffic. I think that's the hard part with these lawsuits is.
So, I don't think the lawsuit's going to come down onto like the red teamers or anything like that, assuming they had, which they probably do. I don't think they're, going to be responsible or liable for anything. That said, if Equifax can show that, they did due diligence and did have reports indicating that things were secure. So, something like the admin password, a red team may or should find that, but you wouldn't find then like an application level test because that's deployment level issue. Right. And like there are a lot of cases where like something like that I think can slip through. Obviously, like if they have like a running red team that's always testing, it should be picked up just as a standard test. But it is something that's only going to be in the prod deployment. So if you're doing any testing in staging, if you're doing testing in development, if you're doing it there, you're going to see a different setup most likely. And you usually do want to separate some of that testing, especially if there's the risk of actually exfiltrating sensitive information.
Yeah.
So I could understand some of that. Usually, like if they had a contract with any sort of firm, like that's going to include some information or some point where they're not liable for missing any findings. And, it's humans. We miss findings. I've absolutely had some findings kind of come back as things that I've missed in the past.
Right.
Unfortunately, nothing like that big or anything, but there have been issues. It happens.
Yeah, no, and I think that's kind of the point, is that it's okay to make mistakes sometimes, man. I think, people, when bad things happen, they go, well, how didn't this right away see it? When they go, there's an infrastructure of thousands of servers. Sometimes I can understand that things do happen, but this just sounds all.
Yeah, this adds up. Like this is a systemic issues. These are like unencrypted stuff. Like that's one. It's a standard test. Like you're going to notice that if you just try to do anything with the application, you're going to see, hey, no green padlock or no EV thing or whatever.
Yeah,
like it's a really quick and easy thing to see, and it kind of illustrates just a systemic issue. They don't have an automated form of kind of fixing this.
I thought it was interesting to even have it. Sounds like 2-factor authentication for a portal that manages so much. That was again, but that's just reiterating the same point. Yeah, it's systemic. It's just bad all around.
Yeah, and it's fun to point out these really stupid issues that companies that should know better end up having, which kind of leads nicely into the next one here, the CyberLink data leak. CenturyLink. CenturyLink customer details exposed online. 2.8 million records.
So CenturyLink's an ISP, right? It's because I have, I live in Canada. I've never heard of CenturyLink, so it must be a US company or something like that. But yeah, I read a little bit into this, and they said that this database was actually leaked 10 months before. Like, it was actually exposed on the internet for 10 months before it was closed to the public.
Well, not even that. The database was first indexed by Shodan.
Yeah, so it could have been even longer.
Yeah. It was first noticed, and then in November of 2018, and then September here, they actually kind of looked at it and contacted CenturyLink. That said, to be fair, they did close it within 2 days, which is reasonable. I'm not sure if that was a weekend or not, but...
Yeah.
No, that was just midweek. So, yeah, 2 days. It's a little bit long, but
Yeah,
especially just for shutting something down. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so like some of the things that were leaked in the database was, it was mostly PII. You know, it was names, emails, phone numbers, addresses, conversation logs. So I think that the main concern here is targeted phishing attacks using information from this database. I just wanted to ask Auntie about like, how likely do you think we'll see campaigns over the next couple months using information from this database? Like how
Yeah.
do you think it's going to be used quickly?
I do think it's worth mentioning here the type of information that's in this, which we haven't really touched on at all. Which is basically, this was a database used by a third-party notification service. So you've got name, email, phone, address, and some actual customer information. So emails and stuff, and they're like, there's information. Obviously, you were asking Auntie. I'm just gonna say like that I think could be used in like phishing. But there were no like passwords or anything like that were in this.
Yeah, no, and you're definitely right. I think what's interesting, I thought for just looking at one of the examples they gave on that page, it looked like when they send text to your house, like a tech person that comes and fix the internet or whatever it is. It sounds almost like that because it's like, I'm on the way to your premises for your service request, arriving at this time, right? But if it's that third party, it's probably just quite literally handling text notifications, right? And then telling the person who's going to do that service, here's the physical address, here's the phone number if you need to contact them, and email address to verify individuals, I guess. Because conversation logs, I was curious. I was like, I mean, even if it didn't have passwords, that can be great for blackmail, right? But it doesn't sound like it's, your text conversations. It sounds like just support conversation, right?
Yeah, support. I should have pointed that out, yeah.
So, looking at possible inclusion and type of like future campaigns, it's, I think just in general, having email, phone, and physical address, you'll see that on a lot of spam lists, honestly. And so now the next part has a central account number with it. So my guess is you'll see an uptick in it, assuming the question really is how many people had access to this, right? Shout out to dude Bob who found it. He's put out a few things like
sorry,
this.
can you repeat that? How many people did what, sorry?
How many people accessed it, right?
Okay.
Like the guy Bob D, right? He pulled it in September 15th, 2019, right? Well, they said that it was first indexed on Shodan November 2018. So a whole year, basically, around that, of being exposed. Now, does that mean people were accessing it since that time? Like, obviously, we don't know. So it's hard for me to say, because he may have been the only one. I doubt it, because there's people constantly, as you can see, sitting on Shodan, mass scanning the internet, so on. And overall, just to put it simply, you'll probably see some campaigns targeting individuals. How successful they'll be, it just depends. But as with anything, it literally could have just a name and a phone number, and people will find ways to use that to target individuals. I mean, look at Snapchat, right?
I mean, there was one risk that I thought wasn't addressed very like too much in the article. So it talks a lot about the targeted phishing campaigns, and that's like the primary risk of it. Another thing I could see this being useful for is like doxing or open source intelligence, just because especially like email is kind of a big thing to leak. Like when you have email and full names together, like for people who dox people and stuff like that, like email's like the primary vector they use to get that information. So I think that's another thing to look out for too, is if you had an email and you're a CenturyLink a customer and you had your email linked to that, and you're worried about your OPSEC in terms of your email tied to other identities and stuff like that. That's another thing to consider, I think.
No, that's a point. I think it's more scary. I'm not as scared as of the phishing stuff, because honestly, everybody's probably phished to some degree, or not successfully necessarily, but you've probably had a phish in your email at one point or another, right? It's common. It's common even with these things, right? But the level of, like, again, phone numbers are always creepy to me, but you don't want someone to be able to connect you, or your physical address. Another one that if you don't want people to know where you live, that's where swatting happens, SIM swapping, just stalking in general. Like, there's a lot of weird other implications that come from someone hacking you. It's other creepy stuff, so
One thing I will kind of jump on and just mention there, is that this was a MongoDB that was kind of exposed. So in terms of the likelihood of somebody else having found it, like that's definitely a common search because these exposed Mongo is, frankly, it's really easy to happen. And we had the discussion, I think, on one of the earlier episodes about
I was
kind of
going
the
to say,
MongoDB.
I swear to God, we had a discussion about a leaked MongoDB just like this before.
Yeah, we've definitely had this discussion because Mongo, just by default, doesn't really have any authentication on it. It's not meant to be run, like, exposed to the internet. It's meant to be kind of a local thing. So yeah, that makes it easy. So, like, the searching for Mongos happened, so I can't imagine that this was the first guy to find it. I just wanted to kind of mention that before we moved on.
Absolutely. No, it's probably very saturated. Like I said, there's people that sit on Shodan all day long, and there was even a bunch of people when I last used Shodan that went and automatically compromised any MongoDBs they could by deleting the info and putting defaced by whatever.
So
yeah.
So following our trend of companies not really paying attention to their security, did you hear about this, Auntie? The NordVPN stuff?
I did not actually.
Okay, so apparently the NordVPN certificate actually expired in 2018, so like a year ago. So the private keys are leaked, so basically anyone can set up a server and do like an MITM attack and spoof like a NordVPN server.
Yeah, obviously they'll get the warning for it.
Yeah.
But with that, sorry, I'm just trying to make sure we've got the window open. I mean, I'm not entirely convinced that this was Nord's fault. So yeah, the deal is basically their private key for a wildcard certificate for star.nordvpn.com has been floating around. And that's obviously a serious issue. Now, when I say not their fault, I'm actually going to pull up another link here. And I mean, I don't know. I can't say with any confidence about what caused this, but here's the thing. Nord, they used GoDaddy for their certificate. It looks like back in 14 also expired like okay, so that one there lasted until 19. So anyway, early on they have the GoDaddy use for some of these, and I forget what this server was actually for, or what the domain was. I think it was their main domain still. Yeah, NordVPN and www. And then they're on Cloudflare. So you can kind of see like the big group of Cloudflare entries. And randomly in the middle of that, you get this one certificate being issued by GoDaddy that's a wildcard cert. It's just a little bit suspicious to me. It seems like there's the chance that GoDaddy is the one at fault here, that they were compromised or otherwise issued a certificate that they should not have issued here. Now, there's no proof of that. That's purely speculation, just on the basis that they had for quite a while here not been using GoDaddy, and never again either. They use Start.SL, they go onto Komodo, signing it, but it's not being signed by GoDaddy anymore. Besides that cert, which just kind of pops up randomly, and they're really early ones. So I don't know. It just raised a few questions for me that, I mean, we can go and blame NordVPN until we kind of know more about the cert, until Nord actually says something. Like, I mean, it is an issue. It's just, I'm not sure I want to assign blame to Nord just yet.
Fair enough. I mean, a lot of the discussion around the issue was because people were flaming them on Twitter because they had actually just put out an ad saying, ain't no hackers gonna get you on NordVPN or something like that. Something, classic PR mistake. Like, of course, right? Like, they don't learn. But they actually did issue a statement a few hours afterwards. So I brought that up on the stream. So they issued
I'm not
a three-part
seeing
statement.
It, unless all I see is the hex defined thing. Oh.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's yeah. Sorry. I'm just But yeah, they issued a statement saying they're going to look into it. They removed that ad because they said it lacked editorial oversight. It was pretty funny though. They threw a little bit of shade at the community. They said yesterday our marketing department got ahead of themselves and published an ad on Twitter that triggered the InfoSec community. So, but that was the main focus of it. I did want to kind of hijack this news to kind of talk a little bit about VPNs and just to go on a bit of a mini rant about. I hate how VPNs are trying to oversell themselves. You should use a VPN for what it's designed for, which is, like, there's a lot of the VPNs out there. They'll try to say like, oh, this will protect you from viruses, and this will protect, like they try to oversell themselves as like an antivirus.
Can't steal my
blocker.
credit card if you're using VPN, bro.
Well, so
Yeah,
I mean, it
it's
is
like-
worth noting there are features though, like NordVPN has the cybersec feature, which is kind of like the DNS blacklisting for malicious domains, for things like that. So like there is some credence to what they're saying. Yeah, it's true that like they definitely oversell. I'm not. And that part of that though is just the fault of people misunderstanding what the point of the VPN. And yeah, at the core of the VPN is basically just a proxy. But
yeah,
some of these VPNs
yeah, I
do
mean,
have
just,
more features. Than
not
that.
NordVPN specifically. I'm not going after NordVPN, but a lot of them are snake oil. Like, trying to sell. Oh, our VPN does like 15 different things.
Oil, dude.
Yeah. So I thought I'd hijack that for a little bit on that.
That's not even a good rant. I got you a good rant right here. I think
right,
the
all right, let's
worst
go.
part is that you mislead, gullible people that think, oh, well, I possibly couldn't have been hacked because I'm using, VPN. Like, I really hate the commercials. I genuinely hate it because it makes people kind of stupid, right? Because you go, well, I'm using VPN. Guys, if the way that's advertised, like, I'm unhackable now. Well, let's just make sure if you're using VPN, like, I think for the privacy implications, that should be enough to most people be able to say, look, do you want everything you're doing possibly noticeable? But there's no way that a VPN, some of the claims, and the worst part is these YouTubers that have influence on people, they will go and obviously it's an advertiser like Nord or whoever, and they'll go and say, hey, we're sponsored, and just so you know, if you use them, you're protected. Like, people have no clue. Cybersecurity is such a weird area that I feel bad for normal people who have no clue but get suckered into all kinds of random security stuff. Because, like, yeah, see, I needed the VPN. I needed
it's a complex area, so it's easy to sell people bullshit. That's the problem with cybersecurity.
So that's my frustration, is that you already, like, people don't trust a lot of cybersecurity people anyways because they always feel like you're trying to spook them, It doesn't help that then you got snake oil salesmen who, again, half the time don't even know how to properly run a VPN service, right? But I did like to point out that, I don't know if we said it, the actual original people who leaked it, this OpenVPN thing, was a group called KEXSEC, who's a hacking group that, like they're and the funny part is I don't know they've really been part of any major campaign. They were the ones that I think it was some Windows program that came out for its 10-year anniversary and was hosted on some random crappy website, and they replaced it with their binary that basically prevented your computer from booting up, right? Like, these are real hackers. These aren't, little kids that just happen to find real hackers that showed this and said, okay, here you go. Here's the certificate. So I think it's actually even sadder that literally the irony is they got hacked. I don't even want to say it was hacked. They were not careful, and hackers were able to disclose their keys, how much other stuff is going on in the background, But either way, I just thought it was insane. I just love to see people have egg on their face like this.
Yeah, so I do just want to apologize for the background noise because there is something going on in the background. So I also wanted to quickly answer a question we had in chat. Which VPN do you guys recommend? I'll answer it quickly. I mean, I don't really want to endorse, I don't think we want to endorse any VPNs, really. I mean, most people don't really need to use a VPN, honestly. And if you do, you just gotta look around and see which one suits your price point and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm not gonna recommend one or anything like that. So
I'll recommend types of VPN you should get. How about that?
Okay.
I won't recommend a specific one until they sponsor us. Then I will have But I think there's two things you should look for. Either the first one, right? If you do torrenting, because that's what a lot of people do it for, so that your ISP doesn't kick your butt. Look for one that allows for dedicated IPs. Is the first thing, right? That'll allow you to not use listed IP and stream things like Netflix from Japan or whatever it is you do in your free time. And then the other one is, contrary to popular belief, I don't trust any VPN that tries so hard to be like, where I always love the military grade encryption where they're talking about a simple certificate. Like, they make it sound like there's a whole operation. Just find one that a lot of people are using. Again, there's a few of them that I could probably recommend, but won't. Use the ones that most people are using, because most times when you're just trying to have general privacy, you'd rather blend in than stick out by using some weird, this VPN's hosted in the Czech Republic and it only has this many. Like, use the one that's plausible that everyone else is using and just kind of blend in. That's the whole point of VPN.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So that's all. Oh, there we go. Hi there. Otherwise, those are my 2 recommendations.
Okay.
Yeah, which is a fair point. I mean, I'll admit I do use NordVPN myself. Not necessarily giving it a recommendation because I did not do a lot of looking into it. It was more, as kind of Andy said, I just looked for what I needed. And at the time, what I needed was something that would let me access. Essentially, I looked for the cheapest. They had a coupon code out at the time for a significant amount off. I looked for the cheapest thing that I could use on this hotel's Wi-Fi so I could watch YouTube while I was there. That was why I ended up on NordVPN. That's it. There is, I think it's like the privacy guy or something like that, who's gone through some of the details of some VPNs that you kind of use to compare them.
I swear I saw on Reddit some people, then I know Reddit, but some people were like, maybe it wasn't always accurate. It was pretty good, but I know it's a single individual who's curating it, so it's possible, but I am familiar with this.
Yeah, I mean, it at least gives you a starting point if you want to start looking into it. At least a starting point on some of the claims that they're making and stuff, whether or not it's accurate. Or, even things can change, but I mean, it's there. I just kind of pulled the link up. Again, not really sending a recommendation, but I have used Nord, and there are a couple things I've liked about them, such as the fact they provide an audit about some of their security options. But I mean, other offerings have that too. You just need to kind of look at what fits your needs. Like I said, my need was I want to watch YouTube on a hotel Wi-Fi that was blocking it. That's it.
That's what.
Hey, that's one use case.
Yeah, and I mean, I've always been kind of more of a proxy user. Like, I just tunnel through whatever server I have if I need to do something like that. So, yeah, I'm not a heavy VPN user.
Okay. So, yeah, that kind of answers that question. So we'll talk about some tools. So, Pop! OS 19.10 released last week, and I did want to talk a little bit about it just because I hadn't really heard of this before, but it seems like a really cool OS for development. It's not entirely...
They have a really polished page here.
Oh yeah, their page is beautiful. But so one thing that makes it kind of security oriented is by default Pop! OS encrypts your installation, and it's apparently, according to them, the only distro that has full disk encryption out of the box. So you don't need to go through, jumping through hoops, setting up stuff to get full disk encryption. It kind of comes by default with this. And it's more oriented towards developers and, people who would want full disk encryption. So, it's not entirely security focused, but I thought it was worth a shout out. I don't know if you guys were able to check this out at all, but...
Yeah, I mean, I've never run it, so I can't really comment on much. I did find interesting here, actually, the... and this is not security at all, but their apparent window manager. I mean, it just looks kind of interesting.
Yeah, they talked about, it's like a workspace kind of thing, right?
Well, it uses workspaces there, yeah. I don't know if it's just built off Unity. I kind of see that Unity-ish look on there that's default with Ubuntu, because this is built off of Ubuntu. So maybe it is just that, but yeah, the workspace thing looked interesting. Maybe it's just I haven't used, Unity or Ubuntu in a long time. So maybe this is just stock, but I thought it kind of looked a little bit interesting. They mention, in their user types, they mention pen testing as one of the user types they're targeting. I couldn't find much information on what exactly makes this nice for pen testing, though. I don't know if you came across anything.
Not really for pen testing, but it pushes itself really heavily as like a computer science oriented machine. So, I mean, most Linux installations by default will have stuff like Python and that in there. So maybe not specifically for pen testing.
Well, does it have Nano though?
That's a good point. I should have checked that, man. Because if it doesn't have Nano, that's a deal breaker. Yeah. I mean, I might actually give this a try. I'm a bit wary to try out these kinds of Linux distros because, I mean, I've tried some before. I remember I tried Elementary OS once, and it looked beautiful like this one does. It just functioned awfully. There was a lot of bugs and stuff like that. So I don't know
if they
if
put
that's
this
true in
much
one.
time into the website, how much time did they have to put into the actual product?
At least 10 minutes. At least.
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to give any critiques of it because I haven't used it. It wouldn't be fair. It's just I know sometimes that is an issue with these distros, so
Yeah,
keep
no,
that
and that's
in
kind of
mind.
what I'm saying. Like, they've got a polished website, and there's not always, like I said, I haven't used this, so don't take this as me actually commenting on the OS itself, but there is kind of that inverse relationship between the polished website and the actual quality of the product, which isn't always true, to be fair. That said, I mean, is this basically, 2020 year of the Linux desktop?
Sorry, can you repeat that for me?
Are we getting to 2020 year of the Linux desktop?
I mean, I would use Linux as my main desktop if it wasn't for how terrible its support is for games and stuff. I mean, there's games that I play that just won't run on Linux. Even if you run them through Wine, they either won't work or they'll run like shit. So, I mean, that's the main thing with Linux. I like Linux, but
Oh, gross. I see. They have Slack notifications. That's how I know this was definitely made by someone from a startup.
oh no, Slack notifications.
They're like native Slack install.
But yeah, I mean, I think it will be year of the Linux desktop, definitely. We're approaching it. So,
We're getting there. This is just one more step.
yep, step on the ladder.
I was just curious. I don't understand. Maybe I'm the stupid one here. Does it really? It just basically has all the pro languages. It's all by default. Is that it? Or, I mean, I know that the window stuff is really. It seems to be my understanding. I just want to make sure I understand.
That does seem to be part of it. I think neither of us have actually gone and installed this, so it's hard to say exactly what they're offering, but I mean, that does seem like part of it. Although, I think at least no, I was going to mention I think it's pre-installed on some distros, but not all of them. It's not the standard. You usually have to add the packages, so.
Maybe I'll give it a shot too. I like their notifications at least. It is something I haven't seen with Linux very well. Is notifications usually look like crap.
Yeah, it's another poor thing of Linux. Yeah.
All right. Well, Spectre offered to take a chance and install it, so everyone.
I'll be the test dummy. All right. So there was another cool tool that released this week, and that was the JSFuzz. So this actually just released yesterday. So it's pretty new. And it's a coverage guided fuzzer for JavaScript. Now, I do want to say it is a little bit misleading in the way it's worded. It's not for fuzzing JavaScript core directly. Like, it's not for fuzzing browsers. It's actually for fuzzing stuff like Node.js packages and stuff like that for issues. So they even say here, like, it's for finding bugs like unhandled exceptions, logic bugs, security bugs, So, and like out of memory stuff. So it's not for attacking the browser directly.
And I mean, it's for your JavaScript applications, though, which is kind of an interesting take on it. And I can see this, being useful as part of the development process. Writing a library, fuzz it for a while, see what comes up. That said, you do have to kind of set it up, telling you what crashes or what exceptions to ignore. I mean, the gist of it is it basically runs the app or runs the library, makes a bunch of calls, fuzzing calls to it, in a big, try catch statement. And then if it catches something, it checks you can check if the exception is one that you actually want to tell you about or one that you don't care about. And you can do more. There are kind of more app level tests that you can do. It's basically programmable. There's kind of the example of just checking for like JPEG or length of like certain errors to show up and ignore them. That said, it's not from a security standpoint, it has its use, obviously for testing these types of libraries. It's quite extensible. But I'm not sure like how this would really fit into my flow if I were testing like just an application. Because I feel like you've kind of got, it might be really good for fuzzing, but I don't know. In terms of like my process for flow of application testing, there's so much being tested with every input. Like I could see generating test cases, fuzzing inputs, sure, but then not automating quite the result or the triaging of that. And just looking at what happened on the page after I made the request. I don't know. There's a ton of issues. Like I could see this being really useful, but not for a lot of security issues. There are plenty that would be useful for, but without a lot of configuration, it feels like there's also just so much that it wouldn't be useful for. That I don't know. Next time I'm like testing a JS app, I might try and actually see what comes up. But
Okay.
I don't know. It doesn't feel like it's something that really fits into my flow exactly. Like just fuzzing at that level. Maybe I'm just not thinking of the right type of JavaScript applications. Like in my mind, obviously, I'm thinking web apps, which it actually mentions. Like it doesn't run in browser or anything. Like it's not that sort of testing. It is for more Node applications. So, I mean, I haven't done a lot of those projects. Maybe that's part of it. Like I said, I do think it's cool. I do think this has a place. I'm just not convinced yet that it would be part of like my standard testing flow versus a more application oriented fuzzer. Like more agnostic fuzzer that isn't JavaScript, it's just the application itself being tested.
Yeah. What I found most interesting was they actually credit to being heavily based on GoFuzz, which I actually didn't hear about either. So that was a fuzzer developed to fuzz Go applications by Dmitry Vyukov. I hope I said that right. Which was also based on AFL, which everybody knows about. One thing I want to point out is, you can see at the bottom here, they are looking for contributions. And it's a new project and it's pretty popular. I mean, it's got 244 stars, so there's people definitely looking at it. So if you're looking to jump into the open source community, I think this is a good starting project to look at, trying to contribute to. If you're interested in that kind of stuff.
Being security related, again, it's one of those things that would look pretty good on a resume too, to see somebody being involved with that. And I mean, just to be clear, because I was kind of negative on it. I mean, the fact that it's also coverage-based fuzzing does make this an interesting project to look at. Like just in general, like to use and stuff. Like I am being negative, but I am kind of excited by this also. I don't think that really came across. I was going through all the negatives of how I'd incorporate it. I mean, if it's a good tool, you'll find a way to incorporate it. You just need to use it a bit. So, like, I am definitely interested in this. I don't want people to kind of leave this podcast thinking that I'm hating on it or whatever. 'Cause I'm definitely interested. I'm just not sure what its place is going to be just yet for myself. But, I mean, just being a coverage-based fuzzer kind of makes it an interesting to look at in general, too.
It's a balance. You can be the negative Nancy, I'll be the upbeat Spectre. Just kidding. But, yeah, take a look at it. That link will be in the description. I think it's time to move on to our speculative execution section of the show. We got an entire section dedicated to it. So
is this going to be a weekly thing too? Every week we talk about
Every week we talk about speculative execution. So the first one we'll talk about is Chromium. So I actually didn't hear about this, but apparently in July of 2018 they launched a feature called site isolation in Chrome. So it basically, what it seems to, from me, from like a layman's point of view, is like they try to separate each tab into like its own process so that you can't side channel leak data from other processes.
Each site is going into it's kind of varied here. So there's there's kind of two different modes. First of all, this is a defense in depth thing. This doesn't have so much of an impact just in general. It's kind of after the render process has been compromised, to be able to run more like any sort of code, arbitrary code. It kind of limits the type of side channels that can be done by having every site or domain isolated, and then if you have a iframe that goes to another site, that gets its own process or is otherwise outside, but it is limited. So the news here is that it's on Android, which is weaker than the desktop one. The desktop one, by default, every site is getting its own sandbox. On Android, it looks for websites with a password interaction. Once you've had a password interaction with a website, then that site becomes sandboxed or put off into its own process. So for websites that don't have any password interaction, at this point, they don't get the same level of protection. On Android, I believe you can opt in, and devices under like 2 gigs of RAM also just don't get this protection at all, because it does use additional RAM.
Yeah. One thing that should be noted, though, is they note that with their new improvements they've released, it can now handle more like in-depth attacks where the render process is fully compromised, even by like a memory corruption or a universal XSS. So, even if they have a bug that allows them to run native code in a sandbox renderer process, because of the isolation, you can't compromise cookies and passwords and stuff of other tabs and stuff, which wasn't true when it was first released, apparently.
Yeah, and that's specific to the desktop also, not the Android version.
Okay, good point.
But yeah, so that is kind of the messaging system now to get that information. You can't spoof what site you're originating from, like the pipe that it's communicating over. Chrome knows what site you are, knows what you're supposed to access, and it's able to prevent access that way. And obviously it keeps the information out of any sort of shared memory or anything too, which you'd pretty much expect, being that it's a browser. But yeah, that is one of kind of like with this launch of Chrome 77, I think it is. That's where they did add, as you were saying, kind of the stronger thing, but that is specifically desktop, and then Android gets site isolation just on specific pages and not quite as strong. They do mention that they're working on it, on making it a stronger system on Android. Obviously, they have to deal with like the constrained resources that with Android. Like that is kind of a big deal on your phone. You don't have a ton of memory, a ton of processing power compared with a desktop or laptop.
Yeah. So there was also a paper released on trying to prevent speculative side channel attacks, and this talks about a new memory type. So I want to say, like, leading into it, I really like this paper because it offers kind of a lower level view on or not a lower level, but a more beginner friendly view on how speculative side channel attacks are carried out. Yeah, that really stood
out to me. Like, this is a really nice to read paper. I'm sure you still have to have some understanding. It's not like you're going to give this to your 5th grader or something, but
yeah,
it's a reasonably understandable paper, especially for the topic that it's on. That definitely stood out to me also.
Yeah. So the memory type they propose is called Speculative Access Protected Memory, SAPM. So basically the gist of it is they have like a memory pool that's for sensitive data that you wouldn't want being leaked through a side channel. And
okay, totally a side note there, but in my notes, I absolutely read this as spam, not SAPM. So now I'm disappointed that it's not actually spam.
Oh, they should have reordered that to make
they
spam.
Missed they missed something with that. The new memory type. Yeah, my memory's spam protected.
Yeah. So I mean, they talk a little bit about the performance overhead. So I was talking a little bit before that they want to have this area where stuff can go, and it's like a black box where you can just put things into, and you can't leak from it through other things. And the way they implement that is through they compare it, I think, to memory fences like LFence. It's not as performance heavy, I don't think, but there is a performance cost to it, and they do mention that it's quite a large cost to access that memory.
Yeah, well, I mean, it basically kills the speculation on it. Just as the really quick summary of it, essentially, you're able to mark memory regions as SAPM, or protected
Spam.
memory. Yeah. Well, that's what I have in my notes. Mark memory as spam. Anyway, you're able to do that, and the attribute of that is that as soon as you kind of have a load instruction that accesses something in that area of memory, then nothing further will be speculated until that's kind of been resolved. So basically, it's introducing it's basically taking away speculation on memory access to there, which is kind of the point of a lot of these protections, is just figuring out what memory to do that. And that's kind of thing. You have to mark the memory you want to protect, or you have to put it in a specific area, something like that. So it's a fair compromise to just not having speculation. Because obviously, I had mentioned before that I thought people might just come to accept speculative attacks just because it has such a huge performance hit, at least in some cases. This is kind of a really fair compromise, though. You don't get the speculation on access to specific type, or on access to that protected memory. So like, I don't know. I think it's a fair compromise. I think it's something that could be adopted. That said, it kind of comes down to, you have to remember to protect all of that memory, and
Yeah.
you can attack other memory too, or information that's based off of that. So I mean, there are
Yeah,
places
that was
where
my
this
main-
isn't quite perfect.
That was my main concern, is that it's like, it's awesome if it's implemented properly, but like, you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of like mutexes and locking. It's great when it's used, but it's not going to be used on everything that it should be used on, and that's where it's going to miss. It's a good step. Like, I don't want to criticize it and say, oh, it's going to be useless, but it's like, it's just it's one of those things where if it's not used right, it's not going to help very much. So
Yeah, and
Nice.
this is one of
that's
those
worth
things
it.
I could definitely see getting used. Like, unlike some of the other speculative protections we've talked about, this seems fairly practical to implement, easy to understand what it's doing. Like, it doesn't take a huge mental overload to remember about. Although, to be fair, fencing isn't all that bad either. But, I don't know, I could see this being adopted.
Yeah, I did just want to say though, a bit of a critique, I guess, is they don't really have much hard data. They say its performance is pretty good compared to other solutions out there, but they don't seem to have any statistics on that. They don't, like, it doesn't seem like they have a prototype implementation. It's more of just a theory. So that is one thing where I found it kind of weird about the paper, was that they don't have a lot of hard data. It's kind of like, oh, it performs a little bit better, but they don't really share anything that would highlight that. So that is one thing that I think is worth mentioning, is they don't have a lot of stats on stuff like that. So
Yeah, this isn't out yet, but yeah, I mean, the lack of information, obviously, if this comes out and this is something that's like terrible performance, like, using that has like a 50% hit or something, yeah, maybe it won't get adopted. But given the limited nature of it, like, in theory, you're only using this for that protected memory. Like, you can kind of reason about the type of performance changes you might see and compare it to something like just blocking all speculation. This will necessarily, well, maybe not necessarily depend. It does depend, but it'll likely be better than just getting rid of speculation, for example.
yeah. And one thing they do mention as well in that paper is that's all going to be enforced at the operating system level. So obviously, if the operating system is compromised, their defense won't really work too well there. And where that, like, there
But
are
at that
some
level,
levels.
do you really need to speculate if you already control the OS?
I mean, that's a point, but I think there are some things that are even above the kernel in terms of access level, like, like crypto stuff. Like, if you want to leak, like, keys, for example, an operating system level enforcement like that might it won't save you there,
Yeah,
so
I mean, though at that point, though, it's also usually more of a black box, like a TPM module or something.
yeah.
Like it's not really, I think, what they're even targeting with this. Like that's just a different layer.
Yeah, it's fair. So there was another paper that also targets Spectre like attacks,
Targeting
speculative,
you.
targeting me, yeah. But this one doesn't really target it from like the same level as the other one. The other one's obviously it's at runtime. It's trying to prevent like at runtime is trying to prevent code from accessing that area. This one is actually it scans compiled programs and adds in I think like fence instructions and stuff like that. So it tries to detect vulnerable code patterns that would be vulnerable to speculative execution and tries to fix them post compile.
Yeah, so code patterns, yeah, it does add fences. But yeah, it tries to balance it tries to be effective, of course, but it does balance that effectiveness with the analysis time and your runtime overhead. Obviously, fences, you've got that little bit of overhead, but if you're not applying fences everywhere, it's better than or applying fences everywhere is a worse case than just applying it where needed. That said, does like it gets a little bit not necessarily complicated, but it goes kind of deep when it tries to figure out where to place things. So it kind of does control flow extraction. It just uses the binary analysis platform tool to pull out kind of like the control flow. It does taint analysis and address analysis in order to detect tainted conditional branches where, then determines which instructions kind of fall into that speculative execution window. And then from that, or uses that in the taint analysis in order to figure out where to insert those load branches. So it actually seems like it could be reasonably accurate. It's really hard to say, its accuracy without having enough to test against with it. But they did write up a number of, I think it was like 14 or 15, basically test cases, and it was able to detect all of those. And I mean, the theory seems all right. There are some limitations with it. Obviously, yeah, and they mentioned these things like loop unrolling can result in false negatives if you don't provide it all of the taint sources. Obviously, you miss a source, it's going to miss findings, and doesn't really handle indirect jumps very well. So, like, there are some issues with it. So it's not perfect, but this is another kind of almost compromised approach. It's not going to get everything, but it can catch a lot, and it doesn't take much work for you to add it in. And performance, I think they had up to like, just under 5% overhead.
Yeah.
That's not bad.
And this is another paper that I wanted to highlight because it has kind of a more beginner focused introduction into speculative execution stuff. Like, that's one thing I always hated about the speculative execution papers is if you're not like a CPU engineer, you're not going to understand like more than half the shit in that paper. But like this one section in this paper 2.1, they point out a code pattern that's potentially vulnerable. So you see this victim function and it checks an array size, or checks like an index against an array size, and then it accesses that. And this looks like pretty normal code. Like if you're looking at this looks fine. But they actually talk about how you could actually hit that from a speculative execution point of view. So you can actually they talk about how the size check can be a tainted branch, and because of the speculative execution thinking that it'll succeed, like you train it to think it'll succeed even if it won't, so it'll speculatively execute that y equals array 1 at x instruction, so you can read that secret data out from that channel. So I thought this is an awesome little section 2.1 talking about like the kind of the lingo and stuff that goes into the speculative execution attacks. Like I really like this section.
Yeah, that's a really fair point. Just in general, like side channel attacks are to some extent kind of like the black magic.
Yeah.
Kind of like as you treat like hardware hacks, like from a software security perspective, side channel and hardware are kind of those two black magic areas where it's like people do it, but most of the people doing the software stuff just don't understand that. Well, obviously, people do. It's not a hard and fast rule. But yeah, this is a good paper, as you said. It's accessible. It explains things. It goes through it fairly well. It kind of explains their theory, and I mean that matters with this paper too. Like how they determine that's vulnerable kind of matters when you're trying to detect the vulnerability. So it makes sense they're including it. But yeah, like side channels, it's just one of those areas that always just seems to be another step up away from kind of what most people are doing. That there's the barrier to entry.
Yeah. One thing I did want to ask you, did you see anything in the paper that indicated why they used the 007 name? Is it just a play on 007 for James Bond or something? Like
That's what it seemed to be. No, I don't recall seeing anything actually about that in the paper itself as to why they chose that name.
Wasn't 007? Wasn't there a movie
I was
called
kind of
Spectre?
hoping they had like a clever, like.
I mean, it could be, as Auntie just mentioned, like there was the Spectre movie.
Yeah, there's literally Spectre, and it was the 007 movie. So I think that's where they're
That's a
getting
good
it from.
point. I didn't even think about that. There was something else listed in their conclusion. You were talking about how they were testing it against like MSVC and stuff like that, and they actually mentioned that they tested this against a large number of software projects from Google's JSFuzz repository and GitHub. So it seems they went through like a bunch of open source projects and tested it on them, and I thought that was pretty cool too. You know, it seems like it's been extensively tested. So I'm interested to see if,
tested, yeah, but I mean, like I said, it's kind of hard to know what findings it missed, and that's what matters here. Because with almost any case, like you add load fences around every conditional, you've got all of it. Perfect. So what really matters here are all the things that it doesn't catch that it should have. Not so much the fact that it catches a bunch. So that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, was more, it's really hard to know what it's just not catching, because nobody's caught it yet in theory. So once we maybe see some 0 days using the speculative attacks, then they might be able to go and see, oh, well, our program did detect that, and kind of seeing that. Like, obviously, it's been tested. It works. Like, I'll grant them that. And it seems all right. Like, their theory, they lay out their theory here. It seems all right. So, I'm not necessarily complaining about that. It's just without kind of seeing those aftermath statistics, it's really hard to conclude anything. Well, you can conclude plenty about this, but I don't know. It feels like a missing piece of information.
Okay, fair point. But I will say that, like, all things considered, this is I think this is probably one of the best papers that I've read on speculative execution. It's a really good introduction to it.
I just wanted to read the code thing. I thought was really nice. I usually don't see those in a lot of paper, especially so clear cut. Sorry about that, Z. Just wanted to point out too. I really like that they put examples.
I like this one. There was another paper we covered though, not so much on the speculative attacks, but on the side channels. That was also really good. And I called it out then too as being a good overview of the side channels. But yeah, this one kind of reminds me of that one, although that doesn't really help anyone because I can't remember what that paper was about. I think Reload something was the paper name. Reload plus something. I can't remember what the attack was.
Yeah, we'll have to look through our old episodes.
Yeah, I'll see if I could find it when we put the description up, and I'll possibly try and include the link there too.
Yeah.
Kind of moving on from there, we've got, this is just the UK government and ARM teaming up to produce some attack-resistant chips. When I first read this, I mean, my initial thought is, obviously just came from reading some of the speculative attacks, like, what, is this going to be like a Spectre-resistant chip? And I swear I read that somewhere, but I couldn't find it when I looked for it again. So maybe I didn't. But yeah, so ARM and the UK government is basically giving ARM like £36 million to work on this new chip. And my thought was, okay, so if it's not Spectre-based stuff that it's preventing, a lot of issues don't happen at the chip level. I mean, you're not getting all that much. Like, I mean, SQL injection is a common issue. The chip's not going to stop that. That's a logic issue. Sure, we've got some stuff like DEP, which happens at the chip level, so there are some options. But this is so much worse than, or so much more secure than I was expecting. There isn't a ton of information out on this, but do you remember the Morpheus chip that we talked about?
Yep. Yeah, I remember that.
So the Morpheus chip was based on this Cherry model, CHERI. All we really know about what's being worked on here is that, I'm not even sure if it was in this. Yeah. First step is this Morella board test of this Cherry protection model. So what that is the Morpheus chip, what it did was it would tag all of the data, just with like information, is it code, is it data, is it code pointer, is it a data pointer. It would just take the data, and then it did some stuff with randomizing it, and like every so often do certain access, it would re-randomize all the data. What the Cherry thing is, it's not the randomization, but it's that tagging of data and protecting certain accesses. So it's essentially, the one of the crucial parts of that Morpheus chip. They're trying to make that practical, and I couldn't find much information on how much data, but it's a byte level thing, so like every byte gets like an extra bit or two added to it. Assuming it's like Morpheus, it's going to have the 2 bits added to it to detect data, code, and pointers to each, and not allowing like cross-referencing and stuff. Like that is a reasonably solid protection. And we talked about it then. Like it's a real thing, despite Morpheus chip had all the sensationalization about being, the unhackable chip. And obviously there are things you can do, but I don't know. I mean, I kind of hope this works out. I mean, in terms of writing exploits, maybe not, but in terms of security, yeah, I mean, we don't have a lot of information, but it's an exciting move.
So, I mean, you were talking about, when you started reading about it, you were talking about thinking about it from a speculative execution point of view. I was thinking about it more from a mitigation point of view, like researching into new mitigations. Obviously, the newest one that came out for ARM chips was PAC, pointer authentication. iOS has it. Android's trying to get it. So I'm thinking it's more towards the mitigation side of things. That being said,
well, yeah, I mean, this Cherry is a mitigation, so
yeah,
and that's definitely where they're going with it.
Yeah, I just want to say though, this article kind of sucks because it's honestly it's mostly PR statements. There's not a lot of specifics.
There isn't a lot of specifics, like even from ARM, like there isn't much.
Yeah.
Yeah, you scared me.
This
I
is
thought you were
basically
reading something I couldn't find on the webpage. I was like, where are you reading this
No,
from?
we're just speculating. Like we're pure speculating. There's like nothing here to go off of. So
yeah, and it's not just this article that sucks though. This is probably the best article there is. I did look through a few, and there just isn't the information. Like what they're doing beyond this just isn't there. Beyond this comment, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to shit on it. It's a good thing. I just wish there was a bit more information about what they're actually doing, because they're saying, they're saying we're gonna put 36 million pounds into this. It's like, okay, that's awesome, but like, what are you planning to do with it?
Well, I don't think this statement here is all that bad. Our first step is to create a prototype hardware, the Morello board, as a real-world test platform architecture developed by ARM that uses a Cherry protection model. And enable industry and academic partners. Like that is like you can get a lot of information out of that. Like if you know what Cherry is, you kind of know what they're building.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, there isn't much more beyond that. They don't dive into Cherry, although given the type of people probably reading this, they're not going to know or understand anyhow.
That's fair. I mean, the target audience is important. That's a good point. It's not really targeted to people like us. Sorry, go ahead, NT.
No, you're good. I mean, I agree that it's not meant for you nerds. It's meant for the normies, okay? First off, howdy guys. But no, I wanted to point out what I thought was interesting is that number value actually, what was it, 37 million euro?
36 million pounds, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what that accounts for in terms of USD off the top of my head, but I mean, I'm trying to understand, like, for chips, right? I'm not anyone who builds chips or any of that, but I mean, is that not relatively low for that type of stuff? I mean, I know Intel and a few of the others, I mean, they spend easily, I mean, like billions of dollars on research and development. I'd be curious to see a more fleshed out version of where they see that money going into, because it's really expensive as far as I remember. But they may not be going as in depth as, again, Intel or whoever. Am I
Yeah, like
crazy?
it sounds like they're just, at least the first step is just building this little prototype. So like I don't think they're looking to build this out commercially yet.
Okay.
This is just testing like even the theory of it. Because there hasn't been a lot of look at that architecture, that sort of setup.
That's a good point. Okay. I just figured that was the only thing I was curious about, is it's usually super expensive for
Yeah,
these
I
types
don't
of innovations.
I couldn't even tell you how much it would usually cost though either. I mean, I'm so far removed from that. Yeah, I haven't the slightest clue.
Yeah, no, I thought it was an interesting thing, that investment. I mean, any investment's good. It just, sometimes these things turn into like this $30 million investment will help stop ransomware and stop this and that and phishing, or, and then it's like it bands into crazy things, and I'm like,
Yeah, that's
y-
something
y-
actually this whole document here is kind of bad for that. Like it talks about a lot of attacks that this may not really do much about, like, where a breach has resulted in loss of data or assets. Like, again, I mentioned SQLi a ton. This won't stop that. Or yeah, we talked about the exposed Mongo. Like, again, this isn't going to stop that either. Like, there's a lot of stuff this isn't going to stop that it seems to talk about. Because it just generally talks about cyber attacks and cybersecurity and not the specifics here of this one. I imagine a statement from ARM would be a lot more specific, but yeah, we don't have that as far as I'm aware.
yeah. So once, hopefully they'll put out new information as it goes along, and it'd be cool to that. But for now, it's a bit vague.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they talk about quite a few different funds in that article. Like, I think the 36 million was for the ARM chips, but I think they talked about a few other ones trying to prevent, like,
Yeah, there
tackling
is more.
disinformation campaigns, fraud, and creating wireless, resistant wireless networks. So, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, so it's easy to.
Yeah, I really just wanted to focus on the chip thing there, but yeah, there are some other options.
Yeah. Let's talk about some news.
Can I interrupt you actually? Sorry, Spectre. You're you're sounding really bad right now, so I'll do the quick intro here, and hopefully your connection will improve by then. But yeah, so a German's their cybersecurity agency recommends Firefox as the most secure browser.
Nonsense.
Only testing Firefox, Chrome, IE, and Edge. As Antikai said, they're a bit nonsense, but it really depends on what threat model you're looking at. I mean, so what they did, they do include a link to like the actual guideline that the audit was performed against. It's in German. I can't read German, so I'm going to assume that their summary of it is accurate, which is things like it must support like TLS and extended verification certs, and has to do the revocation checks either with a list or OSCP. Supports things like same origin policy, CSP, ASLR, like just has a bunch of things like that. So it doesn't really care about the architecture of the application too much.
Mm-hmm.
There is one comment, things needing to be isolated. This web page need to be isolated from each other, ideally in the form of standalone process, or thread level isolation is allowed. I don't know why thread level isolation should be allowed, unless they're writing this just to make Firefox seem better. But that's when Firefox would, at this point, mostly fail. They've been making progress towards stronger isolation, but Firefox is not there yet. They do have this thread level, but frankly, thread level isn't isolation at all. There's still all the shared memory. There's still all of that. So, I mean, that's not really isolation. Anyway, they do also mention, I thought interesting, is obviously it has to use defenses like ASLR and DAP, but it has to use a language that supports stack and heap protections, which I thought was just an interesting phrasing.
I don't really know what they mean by that.
I was about to say, what the fuck? What is that supposed to?
Well, there's kind of the question of what it means, but
I mean, I think they're talking more about Rust, like that language. I think they're using the terminology wrong, though, right? I mean, that comes down to implementation. No.
Well, so that was kind of my thing, is must be code using a programming language that supports. So what if you implement it yourself? It's not okay. It has to be a language level feature. And yeah, I mean, Rust does have, I think Rust has, I'd have to go and double check, but I believe it has like the safe stack. But like the heap memory protections are all kind of at the heap level, not the language level.
Right.
Unless they're referring, obviously, like, borrow checker and things like that could, maybe call in as heap memory protections. Obviously, thinking about Rust again. I mean, I'm not entirely clear on that. One of the common complaints about this, though, was they seem to be writing it specifically so Firefox would look good, so Firefox would come out on top.
Well, I did want to say that's why the way they word it, right? So you have this running list of what quote unquote should be included, right? Must support TLS, this, that, the other thing, right? And they go and they did it clever. It's clever editing as it goes. According to the BSI, Firefox is the only browser to support all of the requirements. Where which browsers don't support those specific things? First off, I liked what they did with the lower one, where the comparison of who's not implementing these things and how. Because I guarantee Chrome, for the most part, implements a lot of these same things that they're talking about. But, IE also falls behind. Even then, the list below where it compares them, I thought was funny because it's IE, to be honest with you, Internet Explorer and Edge. But, things like lack of organizational transparency, if you're talking privacy, I think it's the hard part. If you're talking privacy, I totally get it. If you're talking security, I don't know if that really 100% delves into it. The same thing with the telemetry is privacy-centric, right? But it's a little, I don't know if I would call it a security issue as much.
That's a really fair point. And I guess the thing comes down to what your threat model is. And
Exactly.
Initially, I kind of think, like, okay, like, is that really security? It has nothing to do with protecting against, like, ODAs and exploits, which is usually what we're thinking when we say security. That said, shift the threat model. Your average person isn't worried about that because there's auto update, which is one of the things there needs to be able to automatically update. So your average person, like, these are the things that matter. The lack of master password, like having an encrypted local storage of your passwords, that matters, for the average user who's going to get infected with malware, and thus they don't want passwords to be exposed that way. No built-in update mechanism. Obviously, they all do that, but IE anyhow.
Basically all of it's but IE.
But like that's another thing that matters for the average user who doesn't like to update. The one that I find interesting, though, is no option to block telemetry collection. Firefox actually uses Google Analytics on like their internal pages. I think you could call this telemetry. Now, to be completely fair to Firefox, they negotiated a special contract with Google that prevents Google from using that information at like a contract level. From using that information as like their ad campaigns. Like, I could understand that, but technically it's still collecting that telemetry and you cannot turn that off.
No, you can't. But I mean, maybe there is a way. I've never seen. I don't think they're transparent as much as I would argue that Chrome tends to be a little more transparent. That their mission is to collect data, and they're upfront that that's their thing.
So transparent, just about the wrong thing, or the undesirable thing.
But I think it's Firefox could be. You could argue the same thing. Is that I don't think most people realize that there's telemetry built into it, and that it's doing not probably the same in-depth amount, but it's collecting, right? So like you said, I don't even know if that transparency, I mean, I don't think it's as there all the time as it's being implied, I guess I would say. But, again, the fact of it comes down to, again, what is that being used for, even against an average user, for safety? Ad networks and stuff like that are really terrible and annoying. I try to look at this from a standpoint, even as a normal person, what is like the ultimate concerning security implication of that? Or even, I mean, privacy was the only thing, but even then, a lot of times telemetry is somewhat anonymized, right?
Yeah, I mean, but privacy would be the big concern about that. And that does seem to be some that they're focusing on. Like, they do have those the security protections, but a lot of these things are higher level, like more general OPSEC, not so much the browser itself. So I don't agree with saying it's the most secure browser. do kind of agree with you on that, but
Yeah.
I do understand the perspective here by taking these higher level, more removed issues from the technical
Yeah.
side and being more about kind of the individual level. So I can understand the perspective. I don't think secure is the right word to use here. I think that's sensationalized.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
go ahead, Spectre.
I was just gonna say, like, I think you, Auntie, you really hit it on the mark. It's like they conflated security with privacy, and they kind of, you know, they misuse those terms and they kind of put them together as if they're the same thing. And that's the main issue with this with the report.
Yeah, and I wish they would take away IE from it. I don't think IE is officially supported anymore. Anyways,
Nope,
I know.
don't think so.
I know there's old.
No, obviously
old
people
that
use that.
Yeah, I understand that.
Not even old people. Like
That's right.
local government here uses IE6 still.
Really?
That-
Okay.
Wow.
I didn't
check-
know
I
that.
don't know
That's right, you're
how
probably right.
widespread that is, but I am aware that IE6 is still being used.
Yeah, I mean, I did just want to put that. I think the comparison to would be a lot more fair between Edge, Chrome, and Firefox, right? Because I would argue that most of those things I'm seeing, I would argue easily that Chrome and Firefox probably both support. I don't know about Edge because I know very little about it, but IE is obviously that whole list that they provided before the simplified list screams of stuff that IE wouldn't support because it's old as hell, you know? So it's
Yeah, I think Chromium would have been another good thing to add, or at least some option out of Chromium, like some of the forks.
yeah.
Just
I think-
because
I mean-
there are attempts to remove the telemetry, which is the big thing. It's really the only things Chrome didn't have. Just actually another little point is you would expect with this audit that they would have some entry points, some checkboxes that none of these checked.
Yeah.
But you don't. Firefox hits everything. That's where I think a lot of people are saying that perhaps they wrote this with Firefox in mind, just as a positive release for Firefox, and I can kind of see that. Jumping back though with Chrome, like, you know, no option to block telemetry. Again, if you go Chromium, if you go one of the forks, there is the option. And that also, how they measure transparency, I guess, is another question. The lack of master password support actually kind of surprised me with Chrome. I feel like that's something they could have done, or could add in, or should add in.
I'm surprised about that too. In fairness, that is interesting because I thought they. No, it definitely doesn't though. I guess, huh?
Yeah. One thing I did want to add on the security aspect, I think I talked a little bit about it before, but I'll bring it up because it's relevant here. Firefox is one of the least audited browsers when it comes to memory corruption and stuff like that. Like, you know, actually, like bugs in the browser, like security bugs. Chrome is audited a lot. Even Edge has quite a bit of auditing. Safari, like WebKit, has the most auditing. Firefox isn't really focused on too much. So it's like, from what I've heard from people who do browser stuff, Firefox is generally weaker in the code quality department when it comes to security issues. And I think that's definitely worth mentioning when talking about how Firefox is the most secure browser.
Yeah,
You know?
I've heard the same. That's why, like, the headline surprised me by that. For the simple fact that Firefox is also developing a heck of a lot more with, like, the Rust stuff. You know, the Quantum release was also kind of the implementation of part of Servio. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but their Rust only browser. And I mean,
This
the
is
whole
now a
Rust
Rust
stuff.
shilling stream, by the way.
I mean, the whole Rust stuff, like, that's leading to a lot of changes in Firefox too, which I think can kind of impact how often it's getting audited, because, you know, why audit it now if they're going to be replacing, you know, this pretty soon, like replacing some component reasonably soon. And they're slowly rolling out different Rust components to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's. I like the Rust implementation that they're trying to do. I do agree with Firefox on that, but touch on what you guys were saying from my end about the whole, you know, security side. I would consider Firefox and Explorer the least secure for the most part, because those are the ones that I see in exploit kit. and Fox maybe a bit less, admittedly. But I very rarely, if ever, I never see Chrome or Chromium-based browsers in modern-day exploit kits, right? I feel like that's part of that. Like secure, I look for something that no click can pwn me, through my browser. I would still feel more comfortable on Chrome. Again, anecdotal, but you can see a lot of the exploit kits like Speculative and a few others that they basically hit Flash or Internet Explorer. Those are the main targets, not Chrome.
So do those kits not include like even old Chrome days at all? They're just kind of going with Flash IE?
Some of them, but I haven't. I mean, like, I want to say Rig exploit kit used to do that. I'm not even sure, honestly, that. Yeah, it's hard. I just really haven't seen. Again, Flash has been the big ones in Internet Explorer. I mean, for the most part, I haven't seen in the past few years any decent exploit kits that are targeting them. I can look, but
No, I don't think that's necessary. It just surprises me a bit. Obviously, I'm not out there, buying exploit kits, so I'm not keeping up to date on that. I'm not trying to find that click that can pwn you.
I mean, I am. So if anyone, no, just kidding. But yeah.
Spectre, you might want to look into it. Maybe give Lightning Mods a link.
A link? Oh, yeah. I did just want to clarify earlier when I was talking about how Firefox isn't really looked at a lot by researchers. You may be able to interpret that as if, oh, it's so secure that people aren't even willing to look at it. No, it's that security researchers just don't really look at it, so the code is going to be worse because it's not being picked through quite as well. I just wanted to clarify.
But it's open source. Open source is automatically better.
Open source is automatically better.
What is this heresy?
So talking about things that enhance security practices, I can't believe we actually are talking about this, but Facebook is actually doing something good. Can you believe it? I can't.
Somewhat. I mean...
Well, yeah, somewhat.
So Facebook is kind of expanding their bug bounty program to accept third-party or issues in third-party applications. So you can take this as your go-ahead to go hack any site and say you are doing it for the Facebook bounty. Obviously, that's not the case. They do have more details about that. And in order to get the bounty, you have to include proof that you are authorized to perform testing on this third party, or it's something that's passively detected. So they do have that restriction. But yeah, they're expanding their program to allow for vulnerabilities from other applications, which is a fair move for Facebook. I mean, obviously they want all of these places to be secure, but how many of them that don't have a bounty are going to start having a bounty or are going to start allow testing because Facebook's doing that? I'm not going to guess a lot. So I could see this maybe mattering, for somebody that's working professionally, doing a review there and kind of getting some bonus money when they have a finding.
Yeah, I just want to point out this little slick statement they have. Although these bugs aren't related to our own code. But, I mean, one thing I'll say about the Facebook stuff is I've heard of people who have submitted bugs to Facebook, and generally their payout is kind of low compared to many other bounties. So that is something to consider. I think they have a $500 minimum. So, it's not lower than $500, but I've heard generally it is lower than quite a few other bounties. But, Facebook deserves a little bit of praise. We'll give them a little bit of positivity. So,
just a little.
I just opened up a link here. I thought they had their payouts on here, but it doesn't look like they do.
Okay.
But they do include information about the scope and the third-party ones they mentioned there.
Yeah, so they have what's eligible, but not the...
Yeah, and it doesn't provide any authorization that allows you to go and test.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't see their payouts on here like I thought it was.
Yeah. Oh well. But, if you're looking for some money and you want to look into some stuff that uses Facebook, that might be something for you. So, another bug bounty, this is our last topic, is the ElectionGuard one.
Yeah, ElectionGuard. It was just released actually in May, so it's not that old, but it's an
Actually,
SDK. Oh, go ahead.
So I did just want to say I don't even think it released in May. They announced it in May. I think it was only just released in September, late September.
Okay, so it is quite recent.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard of it before this. Maybe since it is
Neither
that
did
new, it makes sense. But essentially, ElectionGuard is Microsoft's SDK, like an SDK that can be used to develop secure voting. I know a lot of technical people are really concerned about, digital voting and stuff, especially any of you that watch Computer File. There's this video that's basically on why you shouldn't, or why digital voting or electronic voting is a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some fair reasons for it. I'm actually just going to drop a link to that video in here, but we won't watch the ad.
Not gonna watch the ad. Why not?
But sorry, I just do that so the link gets added into our show notes automatically. But I've closed it here again. All right, that's it. It's a the fact that they're opening this up. Sorry, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I get that people have concerns about electronic voting, but I do think it's a good thing, and I do think end-to-end verifiable voting is something that we need to move towards.
Okay.
And I mentioned that we might be talking a little bit about homomorphic encryption. That's what this uses. This uses homomorphic encryption to provide some of the security. I mean, we can talk a lot about how it all works and stuff, but there's yet another video from this time where it's Computer File had the negative video, Number File had the more positive video.
Is that on purpose? Did they coordinate that?
Honestly,
like
I have
been.
no idea. I don't think they were released around the same time, so probably not. That
Okay.
said, this video from Number File talks about end-to-end verifiable voting with Ron Rivest. If you're not familiar with him, he's the R of RSA.
Okay.
So he's reasonably established in like the crypto community. He kind of talks a lot about kind of the theory and a bit of how it works, but homomorphic encryption, very basic understanding, because that's all I get about it, is you can perform operations on the encrypted data, and the result of that, the still encrypted result, when decrypted, would match it as though the operation had been performed on the unencrypted data. So you can like count things without actually decrypting everybody's vote, is the classic example here.
Okay.
I mean, it's a really new and interesting area of crypto. Like 2009 was the first fully homomorphic encryption being talked about. It wasn't implemented until 2011, and at that point it took like 30 minutes per bit operation, so not exactly high performance.
No.
Anyway, with that out of the way, Microsoft is including kind of their bounty here on their ElectionGuard system.
Yeah, so unlike Facebook, they actually include a bit more information. They said that it'll pay from $500 to $15,000 US. And obviously, so for Microsoft, for those of you that don't know, your POC quality and your report quality are very important to how much they pay out. So if you have a low quality POC that is hard to, read, it's written like shit, and your report doesn't really talk about the issue very much, you're probably going to see the lower end of that payout. If it's a high quality one, it's a high quality issue as well, you'll see the higher end of that at the 15,000 range.
Yeah, so theirs have opened up the page here that actually says what they're paying out for. Of course, they pay out up to 15,000 for the elevation of privilege. They're also paying out up to 15,000 on information disclosure.
Oh, interesting. I didn't see that. Okay.
Which, of course, I mean, this makes sense given what it's trying to do. So they include like mathematical errors in the specification. So it's not just the implementation, but the specification. You can find errors in that and have that kind of be accepted in this bounty. Obviously, the SDK or API provided, like you can find bugs in that too. But they are including or allowing you to look at theory also. And yeah, like, I mean, they only pay out like up to 8,000 on the security design flaw, or and spoofing, tampering is less. But I mean, they lay it all out here. Honestly, I mean, if I were looking at it, I'm only really going to be able to do the actual implementation testing. I don't know enough to actually deal with the mathematical theory. But I don't know. I mean, I'm excited for this just because I do want to see these voting systems come. They need to get tested. There are going to be issues. But, mathematically things can be done like this and can be done securely despite kind of all the negative press they tend to get.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that this entire like API is all in C. So, it's not only higher level issues you could look for, you're looking for like memory corruption issues and stuff like that. So it's definitely worth checking out if you
But you do have to think about the
auditing.
Level of access you have to anything too.
That's true. That's
like your inputs are going to be quite limited for an election API. So sure, they might have some issues in the C, but actually getting to exploit them might be quite difficult.
Yeah, it will require a lot of like initial research into entry points and stuff like that, for sure. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even really consider it. So
yeah, and, I mean I think that's kind of our last topic, unless you guys have anything to add.
Nope, I'm just disappointed that ElectionGuard isn't going to be used at the Canadian election this year. I'm going to be going to vote later, and it's going to be all corrupt.
I mean, we can comment on what was supposed to happen with elections, according to past campaign promises, but I feel like that might be getting a little bit too political for them.
Just a little bit, yeah.
A little.
That said, we will obviously be back next week. We'll be back on Wednesday, I believe. Spectre, you're going to be looking more at that Android binder use after free.
Yep, so before Wednesday, I'm going to put myself through the torture of trying to set up a virtual machine that doesn't suck so I can get back to the exploit development, and we'll get back to that on Wednesday. Hopefully this Wednesday will be like the last part of that, but if, we get pushed for time and we run into issues, may continue it in the next Wednesday, but not sure on that yet.
Yeah, I'm going to also just toss it out there. If there are some exploits that people have seen and are interested in maybe seeing us do a walkthrough of them or look at them, leave a comment, let us know. We'd like to kind of open up more content like that. I'm not giving any guarantee that myself or Spectre will actually look at any of them that you would link, but let us know. Maybe we'll see some that actually does pique our own interest that we'll take a look at. Yeah, again, we want to do more content like that, make it a regular thing. At this point, I don't think it's going to be, or it's not going to be right now, but definitely let us know if there are any exploits you'd like to have us look at, and please don't just say PS4 all day. And one other last piece of news is that we are now on Spotify, and a few other podcast things, but the big one, Spotify. Google Podcasts has accepted us, but as far as I know, we're not actually live on there yet, and still waiting back on Apple. But we're trying to get this podcast out to be a little bit more accessible for you guys. So if there are any platforms you'd like to see us on, again, drop a link, let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that sums everything up. So if you're just interested in the podcast, we'll see you next week on Monday. If you guys want to tune in to the Android exploit stream, we'll see you on Wednesday at 8:00 Eastern, and I'll resort to
I think that's 5:00 Pacific.
Yeah. I'll resort to you for the time zone shit.
And hopefully I'm right.
Hopefully you're right, yeah. All right, but yeah, thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you guys then.